Welcome back to our read-aloud live stream of A Separate Piece by John Knowles. Today we'll be finishing up Chapter 13 and the ending reading acknowledgements, whatever. To recap, Chapter 12, Finney was injured and sort of had a falling out with Jean, and then he finished dying. Chapter 13. The quadrangle surrounding the far common was never considered absolutely essential to the Devon school. The essence was elsewhere, in the older, uglier, more comfortable halls enclosing the center common. There the school's history had unrolled, the fabled riot scenes and presidential visits and Civil War musterings, if not in these buildings, then in their predecessors on the same site. The upperclassmen and the faculty met there, the budget was compiled there, and there students were expelled. When you said Devon to an alumnus 10 years after graduation, he visualized the center common. The far common was different, like a gift of the rich lady benefactress. It was Georgian like the rest of the school, and it combined scholasticism with grace in the way which made Devon architecturally interesting, but the bricks had been laid a little too skillfully, and the woodwork was not as brittle and chipped as it should have been. It was not the essence of Devon, and so it was donated without too serious a wrench to the war. So here we see the essence of the place. If I could actually write right. The far common could be seen from the window of my room, and in early June I stood at the window and watched the war moving into Occupy. The advance guard, which came down the street from the railroad station, consisted of a number of jeeps, being driven with a certain restraint, their gyration-prone wheels inactive on these old ways which offered nothing bumpier than a few cobblestones. I thought the jeeps looked noticeably uncomfortable from all the power they were not being allowed to use. There is no stage you comprehend better than the one you have just left, and as I watched, the jeeps almost asserting a wish to bounce up the side of Mount Washington at 80 miles an hour instead of rolling along this dual street, they reminded me, in a comical and a poignant way, of adolescence. Following them were some heavy trucks painted olive drab, and behind them came the troops. They were not very bellicose looking, their columns were straggling, their suntan uniforms had gone rumpled in the train, and they were singing Roll Out the Barrel. "What's that?" Brinker said from behind me, pointing across my across my shoulder at some open trucks bringing up the rear. "What's in those trucks?" "They look like sewing machines." "They are sewing machines. I guess a parachute rigger school has to have sewing machines." If only Lepper had enlisted in the Army Air Force and been assigned to parachute rigger school. "I don't think it would have made any difference," I said. "Let's not talk about Lepper." Lepper will be all right. There's nothing like a discharge. 2 years after the war's over, people will think a Section 8 means a berth on a Pullman car. Right. Now, do you mind? Why talk about something you can't do anything about? Right. So Lepper is brought out. Right. I had to be right in never talking about what you could not change, and I had to make many people agree that I was right. Oh, so his coping is ignore right now. It really isn't very healthy. Instead of never talking, it's not never talking, it's don't worry. And I had to make many people agree that I was right. None of them ever accused me of being responsible for what happened to Phineas, either because they could not believe it or else because they could not understand it. I would have talked about that, but they would not, and I would not talk about Phineas in any other way. Very self-centered. The jeeps, troops, and sewing machines were now drawn up next to the far common quadrangle. There was some kind of consultation or ceremony underway at the steps of one of the buildings, Vesey Hall. The headmaster and a few of the senior members of the faculty stood in a group before the door, and a number of Army Air Force officers stood in another group within easy speaking distance of them. Then the headmaster advanced several steps and enlarged his gestures. He was apparently addressing the troops. Then an officer took his place and spoke longer and louder. We could hear his voice fairly well, but not make out the words. Around them spread a beautiful New England day. Peace lay on Devon like a blessing, the summer's peace, the reprieve, New Hampshire's response to all the cogitation and deadness of winter. There could be no urgency in working during such summers. Any parachutes rigged would be no more effective than napkins. Here we see the seasons again. Or perhaps that was only true for me and a few others, our gypsy band of the summer before, or it was rarer even than that, had Chet and Bobby sensed it then. For instance, had Leopard, despite his trays of snails, I could be certain of only two people, Phineas and myself, so now it might be true only for me. The company fell out and began scattering through the far common. Dormitory windows began to fly open, and olive drab blankets were hung over the sills by the dozens to air. The sewing machines were carried with considerable exertion into Vesey Hall. "Dad's here," said Brinker. "I told him to take a cigar down to the butt room. He wants to meet you." We went downstairs and found Mr. Hadley sitting in one of the lumpy chairs, trying not to look offended by the surroundings. But he stood up and shook my hand with genuine cordiality when we went in. As we can see here. Nice guy. He was a distinguished-looking man, taller than Brinkle, so that his portliness was not very noticeable. His hair was white, thick, and healthy-looking, and his face was a healthily pink. "You boys look fine, fine," he said in his full and cordial voice. "Better, I would say, than those doughboys, GIs, I saw marching in. And how about their artillery, sewing machines?" Brinker slid his fingers into the back pockets of his slacks. This war's so technical, they've got to use all kinds of machines, even sewing machines. Don't you think so, Gene? Well, Mr. Hadley went on emphatically, I can't imagine any man in my time settling for duty on a sewing machine. I can't picture that at all. Then his temper switched tracks, and he smiled cordially again. But then times change and wars change, but men don't change, do they? You boys are the image of me and my gang in the old day. It does me good to see you. What are you enlisting in, son, meaning me? The Marines, the paratroops? There are doggone many exciting things to enlist in these days. There's that bunch they call the Frogmen, underwater demolition stuff. I'd give something to be a kid again with all that to choose from. So here we see Mr. Hadley is very sort of traditionalist and social conservative in his thinking. He can't picture that at all. Addition, but still open-minded. As we see over here, But then times change and wars change. But men don't change, do they? Now that's a very important thing right there. He's introducing explicitly the final theme about people not changing, or one of the final ones. I was going to wait and be drafted, I replied, trying to be polite and answer his question honestly. But if I did, that they might put me straight in the infantry, and that's not only the dirtiest, but also the most dangerous branch of all, the worst branch of all. So I joined the Navy, and they're sending me to Pensacola. I'll probably have a lot of training, and I'll never see a foxhole, I hope. Foxhole was still a fairly new term, and I wasn't sure Mr. Hadley knew what it meant, but I saw that he didn't care for the sound of what I said. And then Brinker, I added, is all set up for the Coast Guard, which is good too. Mr. Hadley's scowl deepened, although his experienced face partially masked it. You know, Dad, Brinker broke in, the Coast Guard does some very rough stuff, putting the men on the beaches, all that dangerous amphibious stuff. So, Mr. Hadley came taught about Army branches. His father nodded slightly, looking at the floor, and then said, you just have to do what you think is the right thing. But make sure it's the right thing in the long run, and not just for the moment. Your war memories will be with you forever, and you'll be asked about them thousands of times after the war is over. People will get their respect for you from that, partly from that, don't get me wrong. But if you can say that you were up front when there was some real shooting going on, then that will mean a whole lot to you in years to come. I know you boys want to see plenty of action, but don't go around talking too much about being comfortable, which branch of the service has too much dirt and stuff like that. Hadley, trying to refocus them. On big picture rather than self. Smart guy. Now I know you, I feel I know Eugene, as well as I know Brent here, but other people might misunderstand you. You want to serve, that's all. It's your greatest moment, greatest privilege to serve your country. We're all proud of you, and we're all, old guys like me, we're all darn jealous of you too. I could see that Brinker was more embarrassed by this than I was, but I felt it was his responsibility to answer it. Well, Dad, he mumbled, we'll do what we have to. That's not a very good answer, Brink, he said in a tone struggling to remain reasonable. After all, that's all we can do. You can do more, a lot more. If you want a military record you can be proud of, you'll do a heck of a lot more than just what you have to, believe me. So. Brinker sighed under his breath. His father stiffened, paused, then relaxed with an effort. Your mother's out in the car. I better get back to her. You boys clean up their shoes, he said, as reluctantly in spite of himself, having to. Those shoes, Brink. A little polish, and we'll see you at the inn in 6. Okay, Dad. His father left, trailing the faint, unfamiliar, prosperous aroma of his cigar. Dad keeps making that speech about serving the country, Brinker said apologetically. I wish he wouldn't. That's all right. I knew that a part of a friendship consisted in accepting a friend's shortcomings, which included his parents. So Brinker, embarrassed, his dad. That's all right. I knew that part of friendship consisted in accepting a friend's shortcomings, which sometimes included his parents. I'm enlisting, he went on. I'm going to serve, as he puts it. I may even get killed. Excuse me. But I'll be damned if I'll have that Nathan Hale attitude of his about it. It's all that World War I malarkey that gets me. They're all children about that war. Did you never notice? He flopped comfortably into the chair which had been disconcerting his father. It gives me a pain, personally. I'm not any kind of hero, and neither are you, and neither is the old man, and he never was. I don't care what he says, he almost did a chateau Thierry. He's just trying to keep up with the times. He probably feels left out, being too old this time. Left out, Brinker's eyes lighted up. Left out! He and his crowd are responsible for it, and we're going to fight it. I had heard this generation complaint from Brinker before, so often that I finally identified this as the source of his delusionment during the winter. This generalized, faintly self-pitying resentment against millions of people he did not know. He did know his father, however, and said they were not getting along well now. In a way, this was Finney's view, except that he saw it comically, as a huge and intensely practical joke played by fat and foolish old men bungling away behind the scenes. So, I could never agree with either of them. It would have been comfortable, but I could not believe it. Because it seemed clear that wars were not made by generations and their special stupidities, but that wars were made instead by something ignorant in the human heart. And wars are preventable. That's a fact. Brinker went upstairs to continue his packing. I walked over to the gym to clean out my locker. As I crossed the far common, I saw that it was rapidly becoming unrecognizable, with huge green barrels placed at many strategic points, ground punctuated by white markers identifying offices and areas, and also certain less tangible things, a kind of snap in the atmosphere, a professional optimism, a conscious maintenance of high morale. I myself had often been happy at Devon, but such times it seemed to me that afternoon were over now. Happiness had disappeared along with rubber, silk, and many other staples, to be replaced by the wartime synthetic high morale for the duration. It's manufactured versus manufactured versus real. At the gym, a platoon was undressing in the locker room. The best that could be said for them physically was that they looked wiry in their startling sets of underwear, which were the color of moss. I never talked about Phineas, and neither did anyone else. He was, however, present in every moment of every day, since Dr. Stanfield had told me. Finney had a vitality which could not be quenched so suddenly, even by the marrow of his bone. That's why I couldn't say anything or listen to anything about him, because he endured so forcefully that what I had to say would have seemed crazy to anyone else. I could not use the past tense, for instance, and what they had to say would be incomprehensible to me. During the time I was with him, Phineas created an atmosphere in which I continued now to live, a way of sizing up the world with erratic and entirely personal reservations, letting its rock-like facts sift through and be accepted only a little at a time, only as much as he could assimilate without a sense of chaos and loss. Finney sticks with G. No one else I have ever met could do this. All others at some point found something in themselves pitted violently against something in the world around them. With those of my year, this point often came when they grasped the face of the war, when they began to feel that this overwhelmingly hostile thing in the world with them. There was this overwhelmingly hostile thing in the world with them. Then the simplicity and unity of their characters broke, and they were not the same again. position. Phineas alone had escaped this. He possessed an extra vigor, a heightened confidence in himself, a serene capacity for affection which saved him. Nothing, as he was growing up at home, nothing at Devon, nothing even about the war, had broken his harmonious and natural unity. So at last I had. The parachute riggers sprinted out of the hallway toward the playing fields. From my locker I collected my sneakers, jockstrap, and gym pants, and then turned away, leaving the door ajar for the first time. Forlornly open and abandoned, the locker unlocked. This was more final than the moment when the headmaster handed me my diploma. My schooling was over now. I walked down the aisle past the rows of lockers, and instead of turning left towards the exit leading back to my dormitory, I turned right and followed the Army Air Force out onto the playing fields of Devon. A high wooden platform had been erected there, and on it stood a barking instructor, giving the rows of men below him calisthenics by the numbers. This kind of regimentation would fasten itself on me in a few weeks. I no longer had any qualms about that, although I couldn't help being glad that it would not be at Devon. At anywhere like Devon, that I would have that. I had no qualms at all. In fact, I could feel now the gathering, glowing sense of sureness in the face of it. I was ready for the war, now that I no longer had any hatred to contribute to it. My fury was gone. I felt it gone, dried up at the source, withered and lifeless. Phineas had absorbed it and taken it with him, and I was rid of it forever. Jean no longer has qualms of the war. The PT instructor's voice, like a frog's croak amplified 100 times, blared out the Army's numerals. Hut, hew, he, hor, behind me as I started back toward the dormitory, and my feet, of course, could not help but begin to fall involuntarily into step with that coarse, compelling voice, which carried to me like an air raid siren across the field and commons. So here we see coarse, compelling voice versus Finney's smooth, compelling voice. Which carried to me like an air raid sirens across the fields and commons. They fell into step then, as they fell into step a few weeks later under the influence of an even louder voice and a stronger sun. Down there I found a step as well, and my nature, Phineas filled, as well as my nature, Phineas filled with a vow. I never killed anybody, and I never developed an intense level of hatred for the enemy, because my war ended before I ever put on a uniform. I was on active duty all my time at school. I killed my enemy there. Only Phineas was never afraid. Only Phineas never hated anyone. Ooh, did I? Other people experienced this fearful shock somewhere, the sighting of the enemy, and so they began an obsessive labor of defense, began to parry the menace they saw facing them by developing a particular frame of mind. You see, their behavior toward everything and everyone proclaimed, I am a humble ant, I am nothing, I am not worthy of this menace. Or else, like Mr. Ludsbury, how dare this threaten me, I am much too good for this sort of handling, I shall rise above this. Or else, like Quackenbush, strike out at it and everywhere, or else, always and everywhere, or else, like Brinker, develop a careless general resentment against it, or else, like Leper, emerge from a protective cloud of vagueness only to meet it, the horror face to face, just as he had always feared, and so give up the struggle absolutely. So how people confront struggle. All of them, all except Phineas, constructed at infinite cost to themselves these Maginot lines against this enemy who thought they saw across the frontier, this enemy who never attacked that way, if he ever attacked at all, if he was indeed the enemy. And so ends A Separate Piece by John Knowles. An Afterword by David Leviathan, looking back from a greater distance. Looking back now across 15 years, I could see with great clarity the fear I had lived in which must mean that in the interval I had succeeded in a very important undertaking. I must have made my escape from it. A Separate Piece, Chapter 1. It has now been over 55 years since the publication of John Knowles' classic novel, A Separate Piece, and over 70 years since the events at its core. Hindsight may not grant us any more clarity than readers had before, but the angle from which we see the book has been inextricably altered, even if slightly, from the time in which it was written. A Separate Piece continues to resonate because its observations about human nature are still as true as now as they were then. Human nature doesn't change very much over time. But the story sounds a little different in our ears because the world we know now is different in ways from the world of the characters. Such is the double life of all great literature. There is what it is meant to mean, and there is what it means to any given reader because of what that reader brings to it, and the time and age at which that reader encounters it. Many things call to me through the pages of the book. Some, I am sure, intended by the author, and others not. Perhaps the strongest impression made from the very first sentence of the novel is by the pervasive, evocative longing of the prose. If, as the adult Jean says, everyone has a moment in history which belongs particularly to him, there is an equally strong moment in our personal history that watermarks us, either through halcyon joy, painful tragedy, or, most often, a combination of them both. Jean says his moment in history was the war, but it is clear in every aching description, every tiny detail recounted, that the defining moment in his personal history was the school year depicted in the novel, which actually was the war for him. By capturing it so fully, he renders it timeless, preserved in a way that youth is often preserved, in words, in memory. Knowles is masterful in conjoining circumstances surrounding the events of the novel and his subtext, the underlying desires and meanings. Even when the war is not being talked about, it's being talked about. And often when the war is being talked about, the baser human nature that causes wars and fights between friends is also being talked about. There is nothing separate about this piece, and there is very little that is peaceful about it either. The boys are living in a bubble, and the bubble is about to pop. That's why ultimately it is easy to feel for them. All very white, all very privileged, and all still very much boys. They are, in 1942, supposed to be society's best-case scenario, and even that can't save them from themselves, just as all the money in the world can't stop the fat man of Phineas' equation from destroying the world they control. Then there is the context and subtext within Jean and Phineas' friendship. The context being, it is 1942, and the boys are seeing their relationship through the lens of their time, not ours. The subtext being, there is clearly love and desire between Jean and Phineas, but what kind? In an interview with the Sun Sentinel in 1987, John Knowles had this to say: Freud said any strong relationship between two men contains a homoerotic element. That's not true. If so, in this case, both characters are totally unaware of it. Yeah, because it's not there. It would have changed everything. It wouldn't have been in the same story. In that time and place, my characters would have behaved totally differently. If there had been homoeroticism between Phineas and Jean, I would have put it in the book. I assure you, it simply wasn't there. Because it wasn't. This is what the book means to me, and I completely accept that if there's any gay desire, neither Phineas nor Jean is consciously aware of it. But when it comes to what the story means to me, so much of what Knowles writes gets to the heart of what it would have been like to be gay at that time, and what it can still be like to be gay now. And not that I'm bashing anyone or anything, but here we see how, like he said, what it means to any given reader because of what the reader brings to it, and the times in which the reader reads it. I'm not just talking about the pink shirt. Pink's good color. Some guys can rock pink. I can rock pink. Pink's nice. I wonder what would happen if I looked like a fairy to everyone, Phineas says, adding, well, in case suitors begin clamoring at the door, you can tell them I'm wearing this as an emblem. And when Jean wears it, it seems, standing there in Phineas' triumphant shirt, that I would never stumble through the confusions of my own character again. Yeah, because that's talking about Phineas' character, not the pink shirt. Shirt's pink, because pink's a good color. So much of what Knowles writes about war or youth or friendship also resonates with a love that, to borrow the phrase, so often dared not speak its name. Many gay men, years later, look back and see both their fear and their willful escape from it. If you broke the rules, then they broke you. We can relate. Or, I was used to feeling something deadly in things that attracted me. There was always something deadly lurking in anything I wanted, anything I loved. And of course the beautiful, haunting line at the end of Jean and Phineas' day at the beach together. Perhaps I was stopped by that level of feeling deeper than thought, which contains the truth. Knowles did not write about two boys who know they are gay or have conscious gay feelings, but he certainly created a compelling residence for boys who do. In talking about this, about what the book means to me, I have skirted, of course, the question that has caused endless discussion over the past 5.5 decades. Namely, did Gene mean to hurt Phineas when he shook that branch? Knowles never answered that question, and I'm grateful he didn't. By not knowing what he meant to mean, we can debate endlessly about what it means to us, and in doing so, we will continue to explore and expose our own natures and investigate the enemies we encounter and the enemies we are more than capable of being. Now, here's a Scribner Reading Group Guide, a separate piece. Introduction. Set at a boys' boarding school in New England during the early years of World War II. Early? What are you talking about? That's closer to the... darn Americans. The separate piece follows the friendship of the serious, intellectual Gene and the athletic, charismatic Phineas and the tragic turn in their relationship takes when a moment's impulse has terrible consequences. That's putting it lightly. A separate piece is timeless in its description of adolescence during a period when the entire country was losing its innocence. It is an American classic, published more than 50 years ago and a bestseller for decades, striking in its depiction of coming to age and the struggle to understand human nature. Questions for discussion. 1. Gene says, I was subject to the dictates of my mind, which gave me the maneuverability of a straitjacket. Page 34. Where do Gene's rules for himself come from? Why are they so strict? Probably come from what society's instilled in him. The whole levels of morality and whatnot. Whoever made that, I forget who did. Number 2. Why does Phineas choose the pink shirt for school flag, his emblem? And why does Gene so envy his ability to get away with this? 3. Gene thinks Phineas' secret swim record is too unusual for, not friendship, but too unusual for rivalry. Page 45. Why did this shock Gene? Why is rivalry so essential at Devon? What does it say about the dynamics of Gene and Phineas' friendship? 4. How do the school's rivers, the Devon and the Naguamset, represent innocence and experience in the boys' lives? 5. How is it that Gene becomes Finney alone in their room after Finney's fall, and the next day he's pretty sure I didn't know Finney at all? What is the truth? 6. When Gene tells Finney he won't start living by the rules, why is that the most false thing, the biggest lie of all? Probably because he already was living by the rules. 7. Why can't Finney let Gene tell him what actually happened in the tree? Why does Finney call Gene to apologize for even suspecting him for a second? Because that's not how his world works. 8. Finney says that the winter loves him, while Gene calls the winter treacherous for Finney and his crutches. Finney further explains that when you really love something, then it loves you back in whatever way it has to love. Why does Gene assert that this is false, but it should be true? Probably because the reciprocity requires both. But there's a way to say that. 9. Though Leopard does not play a large role in life or at Devon, Gene has a lot of sympathy for him. Why is this? Why are the boys so affected by lepers joining the war? And were you surprised that Leper witnessed Finney's fall? 10. Why does Brinker force Gene and Finney into the trial? How do Brinker's changing views of the war influence his behavior at Devon and with Gene? 11. What does Gene mean when he says wars were made instead by something ignorant in the human heart? Do you believe that he has made his escape from fear by the time he revisits Devon as an adult? Maybe, maybe not. 12. Do you agree with David Leviathan in the afterword that human nature doesn't change very much over time? How does a separate piece illustrate that? It depends on what you define as human nature. Enhance your discussion. 1. In 1972, a separate piece was adapted for film. Watch the movie and discuss the director's interpretation of the novel. 2. Choose another coming-of-age classic to read, such as Lord of the Flies or Catcher in the Rye. I do need to read Catcher in the Rye. Discuss the book's depictions of adolescence and rivalry, or the differences and similarities in their main characters in comparison to a separate piece. About the author, John Knowles, a graduate of Phillips Exeter and Yale, wrote 7 novels, a book on travel, and a collection of short stories. He was a recipient of the William Faulkner Award and the Rosenthal Award of the National Institute of Arts and Letters. He lectured widely to university audiences. Knowles died in 2001 at the age of 75. And that finishes our reading of A Separate Piece by John Knowles. Thank you for joining me on this last episode of our Read Aloud. Keep your eyes open for any other videos that might come on the channel. Thank you for joining me, and have a wonderful day.